You feel the metal before you see it. Cold bronze. It presses against your jaw, smelling of old blood and furnace soot. The man holding the tongs does not hate you. He does not even know your name. He works with the bored rhythm of a butcher at the end of a long day. A sharp twist. A wet snap. Your tongue is gone. You open your mouth to scream, but the sound is instantly smothered by the copper-tasting flood of your own life. You wait for the final blow to end the agony. It does not come. In the kingdom of the Pharaoh, silencing you was not the end of the sentence. It was only the opening ceremony. In the modern world, we look at the executioner's axe as the ultimate terror. We believe that to take a life is the final word in justice. But to the architects of the new kingdom, death was not a punishment. Death was a gift. It was a mercy that the state was not always willing to give. For a citizen of Egypt, the end of the pulse was simply a door. If you died with your body intact and your name spoken by your children, you transitioned. You moved toward the field of reeds. You drank from the waters of the gods. Your soul, your Ka, remained anchored to the world of the living through the rituals of memory. To kill a criminal was considered sloppy governance. A corpse is a silent thing. A corpse cannot work. A corpse cannot serve as a living billboard of royal power. The pharaohs desired something far more surgical than a simple hanging or a quick blade to the throat. They wanted to hollow you out while your chest kept rising and falling. They wanted to erase the man without killing the animal. They wanted a walking ghost. The removal of the tongue was the first step in this spiritual dismantling. The tongue is the instrument of truth. In the Egyptian afterlife, a soul must stand before the scales of Osiris. You must recite the negative confessions. You must say, "I have not stolen. I have not lied." But a man without a tongue stands silent in the court of the gods. Silence, in that courtroom, is an automatic confession of guilt. By taking your voice, the state was not just stopping your speech in the marketplace. They were preemptively damning your soul to be eaten by the devourer. They were ensuring that your silence would echo for eternity. But the blade was hungry for more than just speech. After the tongue was cast into the dust, the executioner reached for a different tool. He took a heated copper knife, glowing a tired, furnace red. He stepped closer to your face. One guard looped a leather strap around your forehead, pulling your skull back against his chest. Your eyes could not even flinch away. The executioner pinched the tip of your nose. He tugged the cartilage outward. With a single, smooth stroke, he pulled the superheated metal downward. The metal hissed through the flesh. It made a wet, domestic sound, like a green branch bending until it snaps. Blood does not trickle from the face. It erupts. The network of vessels in the nose is dense, a map of red rivers that suddenly find no banks. You gasp in raw reflex, and you immediately inhale your own blood. You choke. You cough. Red spray paints the limestone dust at your knees. The executioner does not wait for you to recover. He returns to the brazier and lifts a flat iron disc. He presses it directly into the center of your face. The square fills with the smell of cooking human meat. This is cauterization. It is not done to save you. It is done to make sure you do not have the luxury of bleeding out. The state needs you upright. It needs you to walk. It needs a living monument to its reach, a man wearing the ruins of a face, wandering through the world as a warning that every citizen can read from across a crowded market. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The pain of the blade is physical, but the true punishment of the pharaoh is psychological. In ancient Egypt, you were not an individual. You were a knot in a vast, social fabric. You were a son, a father, a member of a village, a servant of a specific god. Your identity was held in place by the people who looked at you and recognized your face. When the state removed your features, they did more than just cut flesh. They unraveled the knot. The moment the iron cooled on your face, you ceased to exist in the records of the living. Back in the provincial capital, a scribe sat on a mat of plaited reeds. He did not look at you. He did not need to. He found your name on a papyrus scroll, the name your mother gave you, the name you carried through your childhood. With a single, thick stroke of black ink made from soot and gum, he crossed it out. Beside the strike-through, he wrote your new identity, the fallen one. Or perhaps, the forsaken. This was the beginning of the social death. In the eyes of the law, the man you were had died in the courtyard. Your wife was legally a widow, yet she could not mourn you. Your children were orphans, yet they could not perform the funerary rites that would save your soul. The state issued a decree. To speak your original name was a crime. To offer you a cup of water was treason. To acknowledge that you were once a human being was to invite the same blade to your own face. The isolation was total. Imagine standing in the center of your own village, the place where you were born, and seeing your neighbors look directly through you. They did not see a friend. They saw a walking sign. They saw a biological pollution that threatened the harmony of Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. To them, your presence was a wound in reality. Then came the chains. Guards forced copper collars around the necks of the condemned. These were not light chains. They were heavy, industrial links that bit into the collarbone. Chain connected to collar. Collar connected to waist. You were fastened to a line of others just like you, men with the same hollowed faces, the same cauterized craters, the same rhythmic, wet breathing. The sound of the march began. It is a sound that haunts the history of the Sinai. The rhythmic clink-clink of copper hitting copper. The heavy, dragging shuffle of bare feet across sun-baked stone. The guards did not speak to you. They drove you like cattle. They used leather whips not to punish, but to maintain the pace. You began to walk eastward, away from the green ribbon of the Nile. The Nile was life. The Nile was the gods. As the palm trees thinned and the sand took over the horizon, you realized the geography of your sentence. You were being pushed out of the black land, the fertile, sacred earth, and into the red land, the void of chaos. Every mile you walked was a layer of your past being stripped away. Your home disappeared behind the dunes. Your language disappeared because you had no tongue to speak it. Your community was replaced by a line of silent, broken strangers. The state was methodically peeling away every layer of what made you human until only the stubborn, animal instinct to keep breathing remained. You were no longer an Egyptian. You were a cargo of flesh, being delivered to the edge of the world. The road to the east was not a path, it was a furnace. The Egyptians called it the way of Horus. For the Pharaohs' armies, it was a road of glory. For the merchants, it was a road of gold. For you, it was a slow, agonizing descent into the white heat of the Sinai. The sun in the desert is not a light. It is a weight. It slams down on the limestone floor, reflecting upward into the raw, open cavities of your face. Every step kicked up a fine, alkaline dust. In a healthy man, the nose filters this grit. In you, the dust traveled straight into your windpipe. It settled in your lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Because your mouth was a ruin of scar tissue and your tongue was a stump, you could not spit the grit out. You swallowed the desert, inch by inch, until your throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The logistics of the march were a masterclass in clinical cruelty. The state had calculated the exact amount of water a body needed to keep moving, and they provided not a drop more. Water was kept in sealed clay jars lashed to the backs of donkeys. It was warm, stagnant, and tasted of the jar's lining. When the guards finally allowed a drink, the act of swallowing was a fresh torture. Without a nose to regulate air pressure and without a tongue to direct the liquid, the water spilled. It ran down your chin. It mixed with the dust on your chest into a thin, pink mud. You gagged as the water hit your lungs instead of your stomach. If a man fell, the chain did not stop. The copper collar around his neck would jerk tight, hissing against the skin. The others in the line had to lift him, or they would have to drag his dead weight through the sand. The guards did not help. They watched with the detached interest of a man watching an insect struggle in a web. To them, you were not a prisoner. You were a unit of labor in transit. If a unit broke beyond repair, they unhooked the clasp, left the body for the jackals, and updated their scrolls. The bureaucracy was more durable than the flesh. Isolation is often thought of as being alone in a room. But the isolation of the Sinai March was worse. You were surrounded by men, yet you were in a sensory tomb. You could not talk to the man chained to your left. You could not hear the story of the man behind you. The only communication was the vibration of the chain. A sharp tug meant walk faster. A heavy slack meant someone has collapsed. At night, the desert inverted its cruelty. The temperature plummeted. The heat that had baked your brain during the day vanished, replaced by a wind that sliced through your thin linen rags. The exiles huddled together in the dirt, trying to share the warmth of their bodies. There was no fire for the damned. You sat in the dark, listening to the guards laughing by their campfires, smelling the roasted meat they ate. In those hours of freezing silence, the psychological erasure reached its peak. You began to lose the memory of your own voice. You tried to think of your name, but the syllables felt clumsy and foreign in your mind. You looked at the stars, the same stars that hung over your home, but they looked different here. They looked cold. They looked like the eyes of gods who had turned their backs. You realized then that the state had succeeded. They didn't just take your nose or your tongue. They had taken your place in the universe. You were a ghost hauling a copper chain across a void, moving toward a destination that had no name in any map of the living. You were moving toward the silence of the faceless. After weeks of walking, the horizon finally shifted. The endless dunes gave way to a flat, salt-crusted plain that met the gray edge of the Mediterranean Sea. There were no limestone walls here. There were no towering statues of the Pharaoh to mark the border. There was only a sprawling, crooked shanty town of mud and driftwood. This was Rhinocolura, the city of the cut-off noses. The guards halted the chain at the crest of the final dune. They reached out with heavy bronze keys and unlocked the copper clasps. For the first time in weeks, the weight left your neck. But the relief was an illusion. The guards did not point toward a prison gate. They simply turned their backs and began the long walk back toward the west, back toward the Nile, back toward civilization. They left you standing in the sand, a free man in a land where freedom was a death sentence. You walked down into the settlement. The first thing that hit you was not the smell of the salt or the rot of washed-up fish. It was the silence. A human city is a noisy machine. It hums with the sound of merchants, the laughter of children, and the shouting of neighbors. Rhinocolura was an acoustic vacuum. Thousands of people moved between the mud huts, yet the only sounds were the scrape of wooden tools and the relentless crash of the waves. You saw a man drop a heavy stone on his foot. He did not scream. He simply collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his mouth open in a wide, silent howl. The social structure of the city was built on a brutal, animal logic. There were no judges or priests here. Power belonged to those who had survived the longest. The veterans, men whose facial wounds had long ago hardened into thick, gray bark, ruled the wells. They did not use words. They used a language of rhythmic clapping and sharp hand signals. A newcomer was at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. You were fresh, you were weak, and your wounds were still weeping. To the veterans, you were a liability. If you wanted water, you had to earn it. You were assigned to the mud pits. You spent your days mixing salt-heavy dust with seawater to form the bricks that built the city. The salt ate into the raw sores on your hands. The sun baked the brine into your skin until you felt like you were being mummified while your heart was still beating. There was no mercy for the sick. In the Nile Valley, a man with a fever is tended to with honey and clean linen. In Rhinocolura, a man who could not work was a mouth that the city could not afford to feed. If you collapsed from dysentery or heatstroke, you were not carried to a bed. You were dragged to the edge of the salt flats and left in the sun. The community did not watch you die out of hatred, they watched out of necessity. They returned to their bricks because work was the only thing that kept the desert from reclaiming the city. By the end of the first month, the you that had left the Nile was gone. The shock had settled into a numb, freezing routine. You learned to catch the meager silver fish from the surf using woven reed traps. You learned to lick the morning dew from the surface of stones. You learned the most terrifying lesson of the exile, that the human body is a machine designed to normalize trauma. You stopped looking for a way home. You stopped waiting for a pardon. You became a part of the silence. You were now a citizen of the Republic of the Damned. To be an Egyptian was to live in a world where the air was thick with the divine. Every sunrise was the rebirth of Ra, every flood of the Nile was the tears of Isis. But in the salt flats of Rhinocolura, the gods were gone. The state had not just exiled your body, they had excommunicated your soul. In the city of the Faceless, there were no temples. There were no white-robed priests burning frankincense to soothe the nostrils of the statues. There was no stone to carve the image of Osiris, and even if there were, no man had the tools or the right to do it. The inhabitants lived in a spiritual vacuum. They believed that the Pharaoh, the living bridge between heaven and earth, had physically cut the thread connecting them to the cosmos. This was the true surgical nature of the punishment. The Egyptians believed the soul was a complex machine of many parts. One of the most vital was the Ka, the life force that required breath and offerings to survive in the afterlife. By removing the nose, the state was physically sabotaging the Ka's ability to breathe for eternity. They were ensuring that when you finally died, your soul would wake up in a ruined vessel, suffocating in the dark of the underworld, unable to smell the incense of paradise. The horror of this spiritual abandonment manifested in the way the city handled its dead. In the Nile Valley, death is an industry of memory. Mummification, prayers, and tomb paintings ensure that the name lives forever. In Rhinocolura, death was a logistical problem to be solved quickly. When a man finally succumbed to the salt or the lash, there was no opening of the mouth ceremony. There was no natron to dry the flesh or fine linen to wrap the limbs. His former neighbors, men with the same hollowed faces, would drag the body into the dunes. They used driftwood shovels to dig a shallow trench. They rolled the corpse in, still wearing its rags, and covered it with the gray, alkaline sand. There was no marker, no stela, no name. Within hours, the wind would reshape the dune, erasing the location of the grave. The sand did not remember. The sand did not care. The man vanished as if he had never been carved into the census of the world. This absence of ritual created a unique type of psychological pressure. Without the hope of an afterlife, the present moment became a heavy, crushing weight. The exiles were the only people in the ancient world who lived without a future. They worked not for the gods, and not for their ancestors, but for the next hour of breath. Yet, in this vacuum, a strange and cold new culture began to grow. Since they were dead to the gods, they became fiercely loyal to the living. They forged alliances born of shared deformity. A man who could no longer speak his own name would spend hours helping a newcomer weave a shelter that would survive the winter gales. They became a hyper-functional society of ghosts. The state had tried to create a collection of broken individuals, but the desert had forced them to become a single, silent organism. They were no longer Egyptians. They were something new, something forged in the absence of light. They were the masters of the void. The Pharaohs believed that by sending the mutilated to the edge of the world, they were throwing them into the trash heap of history. They assumed the desert would act as a slow, natural executioner. But they made a fundamental mistake in their calculation of the human spirit. They forgot that when you take everything away from a man, his name, his face, his gods, you leave him with nothing but his stubborn, animal refusal to die. As the years turned into decades, Rhinocolura did not vanish. It hardened. The men who survived the first 5 winters became like the desert itself, ancient, scarred, and impossible to break. Their skin thickened into a texture like old leather. Their nervous systems adjusted to the constant sting of the salt. They stopped being victims and became a new kind of human being, a caste of survivors who feared nothing because the worst had already happened to them. The city began to grow. It stretched along the coast, a sprawling monument to endurance. The human firewall that the state had engineered to protect the border from invaders became a functional society. They traded cured fish for copper needles. They wove nets from seagrass that were stronger than the linen nets of the Nile. They even began to take wives from the wandering Bedouin tribes of the Sinai, who saw in these faceless men a strength that the soft citizens of the valley did not possess. The children born in Rhinocolura were a miracle. They were born with whole faces. They were born with tongues that could speak. But they were raised on the stories of the silence. They inherited the iron discipline of their fathers. They looked at the ruins of their parents' faces not with horror, but as a map of the price of survival. Eventually, the great empires that had condemned these men began to rot. The new kingdom crumbled. The pharaohs who had signed the decrees of mutilation were wrapped in gold and buried in stone, only to be forgotten as the sands shifted. The central authority of Egypt slipped, and the guards at the fortress of Chiaru stopped watching the horizon. By the time the Greeks and Romans arrived centuries later, they did not find a graveyard. They found a thriving port. The city of the cut-off noses had become a vital hub for the spice and incense trade. The descendants of the exiled, the children of the nameless, were now the wealthy gatekeepers of the Mediterranean. They built limestone villas over the mud huts of their ancestors. They drank fine wine from silver cups on the same beaches where their grandfathers had once licked moisture from their palms. The irony was total. The state had tried to erase them from existence, but the exiles had outlasted the state. The pharaohs were now museum pieces, their names deciphered by foreign scholars. But the city of Rhinocolura lived on. It proved that justice, when it is too cruel, fails its own purpose. You cannot erase a man by cutting him, you only redesign him into something more dangerous. The legacy of the Faceless men is the ultimate form of vengeance. It is not a vengeance of blood or fire, but a vengeance of duration. They did not march back to the Nile to burn the palaces. They did something much more powerful: they survived. They built a world out of salt and silence. They stood on the dunes and watched the empire that tried to kill them turn to dust, while they remained, upright and breathing, under the desert sun. Survival was not just their sentence. It was their victory. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.